With this lesson, we're going to take another step closer to being able to improvise while soloing. And that next step is to start applying variations to riffs that you already know. And with variations, you're going to start rearranging riffs with a more spontaneous or creative approach. And that's very different from learning to copy riffs note for note. So if you haven't yet tried variations, it's more challenging than you think, especially when it comes to playing with the backing rhythm. So what we're going to do with this lesson is show you how to start applying variations with the step-by-step approach. Now before you try variations, you should first have a foundation of minor scale soloing basics down. And that starts with knowing the standard minor scale box pattern and being able to play a handful of riffs in different keys with the pattern. You should also have some technique down, and that includes vibrato, hammering, pulling off, and phrasing. And finally, you should have some experience playing minor scale riffs over a backing rhythm. And now you can review any of these topics with my previous lessons on the minor scale. But otherwise, let's get started with using variations. We're going to start by applying variations to a riff that I refer to as the minor scale riff. It's a standard riff. It's usually the first riff I introduce to students when playing flamenco, and here's how it sounds. Now, the initial approach with students, especially beginners, is that we copy riffs verbatim. In other words, note for note exactly as they are. It's the same approach used when you learn to read or write. You copy sentences initially exactly as they are. You don't start rearranging the words. And with that, you have a good foundation to build on. Same approach with learning riffs. We learn them note for note, and then we develop a collection of riffs. And then, when you can play a bunch of riffs together, we practice playing against a backing rhythm for maybe 30 or 45 seconds. And then comes the variations lesson, where after a month or two of playing that same riff over and over, once a student has it down, I'll start off a lesson and I'll say, hey, take that standard riff and do something creative with it. Throw in a variation of one or two notes. The reaction I get is usually a blank stare. It's not the student's fault, but the approach we've used up to that point is sort of a paint-by-numbers approach. The student is used to copying everything exactly as it is. It's the same for most of you when you first learn to play guitar and riffs. So when you ask a student to all of a sudden be creative, it's sort of like asking a kindergartner to start writing stories when they're first learning to copy sentences. So the best approach to sort of start off with variations is to start applying them one or two notes at a time. So going back to the initial minor scale riff, we're going to apply a variation on the third string, and the phrase we played on the third string was 4, 5, 7, 5, 4. Well, the variation is going to be this, and then the same ending. That variation is a hammer pull-off combination, keeping the first finger planted or anchored on that fourth fret, plucking the note once but sounding two additional notes. There's your 4, 5, 4. And so here's the variation. And we'll play that variation again. Now it's a slight variation, but again, if you haven't tried this before, it's a little trickier than it looks. So when you know you have it down, is we're going to put the initial riff together with the variation. I'll play the initial riff first, and we'll follow it with the variation. So here we go. We can use that variation as a springboard for additional variations. So again, with between the fourth and fifth frets, here's one where we just repeat the hammer pull-off. We play it 3 consecutive times. And then we follow it with the root note slide for the ending. Let's do that one again. And again, to get acclimated to all these variations, Let's put the first variation together with the second one. So here's the initial one we did. Now the same phrasing we applied to that third string variation, well, we can apply that to other strings from that minor scale riff. So let's extend it a little bit more. We're going to apply this phrasing to all of the strings, at least the first three strings, and here's what I mean. So instead of, we're going to add the variation. Let's do this one again. In the next clip, you can hear how these variations sound played over a backing rhythm in the key of A minor. And as a first step, I would just listen to the track to hear how the riffs harmonize. And then when you're ready, play along with the riffs. One additional note, at the end of the track, you want to play a root note ending. Land an A note against that final strummed A minor chord. That will produce a harmonized ending. But it can throw you off a little bit. When you're concentrating on these new riffs, the rhythm can sometimes throw you off initially. So once you can keep up with this track, then you're ready for the next step. Next, we'll apply some variations to another riff we previously did, and I call this the hammer riff. Again, there's a hammer technique in this, and here's a variation, again, playing off that second string. We'll do, again, a hammer pull-off. And what we'll do is we'll play that 3 times and then jump to the root note ending on the top string. Here's how it's going to sound. We'll do that again. And then we can extend the riff a little bit, going back to repeating this hammer pull-off 3 times, and then shifting the root note to the 4th string 7th fret. So here's the complete riff, the complete variation. If we combine that with the initial riff, give a little space for the root note, and then the variation. Another variation from the hammer riff would be this. It's a little bit tricky on this one. We're going to start with the same hammer. Then the hammer pull-off. And why it's a little tricky, even though it sounds good, is you're going to take the 3rd finger and then it's going to jump down from the 3rd to the 4th string to the root note. So here's this variation again. Now let's put together all variations from the hammer riff. We'll start with the initial riff. Here's the first variation. And the 3rd variation. Another riff we did from a previous lesson was the low strings riff. Now with that, instead of the variation we can apply is we can hammer these notes on the 6th and 5th strings, like so. Still 5, 7, 8, except the last 2 notes are hammered. And then we end it the same. So the variation is this. do that again, speed it up a little bit. And from that, we can use that riff as a springboard. We can maybe extend the riff a little bit like so. So what we did is we extended the riff, we doubled it, and then we added a variation jumping to the bottom string, the low string, 6th string root note. So let's back it up. We'll review the low strings variation starting with the initial riff. First variation, and the last variation. In another previous lesson, we applied tremolo picking technique to a basic riff on the 2nd string, and that involved following an interval pattern. We started on the 5th fret. This is again in the key of A minor. We started on the 5th fret, and then we did an interval pattern of a half step, which is going from 5 to 6, 1 fret, and then 3 consecutive whole steps, whole, 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 then a half step, and then 2 more whole steps. And then we basically went down the same way we went up, and then we ended on an A root note. Well, applying variations to that, as long as you know the intervals, or even if you can visualize the frets, in this case in A, 5, 6, 8, 10, and 12 to start, you can swim around any order you want and apply tremolo technique. You can also start with an immediate slide. If you know there's a correct note on the 12th fret, you can slide up. Finally, we've showed you a root note focus on that top string. Well, adding a variation, if you figure out where another A root note is on the 2 string within that pattern, in this case, 2nd string, 10th fret, you could do a tremolo picking run and end on that root note instead. You can even apply variations going up and down the basic box pattern. This goes back to lesson 1 or level 1 with working with the scale. Here's the standard box pattern, the minor scale box pattern. Well, we could do a variation starting in the middle of that pattern. Say we started on the 4th string, 5th fret. Let's do that again. And then from there we can do a descending riff, again just going down the box pattern, following the box pattern. And this time stopping on the root note and playing that root note twice. Dun, dun. So let's put together those 2 variations, starting with the ascending one on that 4th string, 5th fret. And then starting with that same note. And then I'll go back and review the complete pattern. Now up to this point in the lesson, we've provided all the examples of variations for you. The next challenge is for you to try and create variations on your own. And that's what improvising is all about, being creative or spontaneous with the scales and riffs that you can play. And the only way to break out of that habit of repeating the same old riffs is to start to explore and swim around those box patterns. And we've only worked in this lesson with 1 box pattern. So as long as you stay within this box pattern, all the variations you try out are going to harmonize, especially along with the backing rhythm. Now coming up, we're going to have another backing rhythm track, and this time you can try out your variations in a different key. But before we do that, we want to give you a couple of pointers for making variations on your own. And number 1, you want to start with the same approach we did with the previous examples. In other words, you want to start off with maybe a 1 or 2 note variation, and then as you get more comfortable, gradually build up the number of notes. And once you start building up, you also want to apply a root note focus. And what I mean by that is phrasing your root notes, beginning and ending on the root notes. Now you always don't have to do that, but early on, if you apply a root note focus while you're trying out new variations, it's simply going to sound just a little bit more cohesive when you're playing with that backing rhythm. As long as you keep working at and trying out different variations, you're eventually going to come up with some riffs that might surprise you in how good they sound. This is especially true if you try out these riffs with the backing rhythm and record yourself. A lot of the classic solos that you've heard are the result of this, where the guitarist is simply trying out new things, but they happen to catch out these new riffs on tape. And so I would suggest to do that. If you can record yourself, you find the riffs you like, and those are your signature riffs. Riffs that you like, that you discover by accident, but that you can use again and add to your riff vocabulary. Now, every riff we've done so far has been in the key of A minor. So what we're going to do with the next clip, the next rhythm track, is we're going to shift everything up 2 frets to the key of B minor. And also on the screen, you'll see a list of the riffs we've covered in this lesson, and that'll give you some ideas to try out your new variations.